Good morning, afternoon and evening, and welcome to the Inception conference of Think7 Italy, co-chaired by ISPI and IAI. The title we picked for this event is G7 at 50, as the G7 was created in 1975 when Canada joined the group of 6. So the G7 is turning 50, but if we look at the international landscape, there is not much to celebrate. Conflicts from Gaza to Ukraine and unfortunately well beyond, increasing protectionism and economic confrontation, and global challenges from climate change to digital transformation, which risk being out of control. But the reason why we are here today is not to give in to pessimism, quite the opposite. As a global community of think tanks, we are here to acknowledge the importance of international cooperation and provide research-based policy recommendations to the G7. In our view, the G7 is not at odds with the G20 and other multilateral fora, but it is a way to aggregate consensus to better face, at the global level, common challenges. That's why, as Think7, we will do our best to cooperate also with our Brazilian colleagues of the Think20 without, as much as possible, overlapping with what they are doing this year. So let's have a closer look at the framework of T7 Italy this year. You see in the slide that in line with the previous T7 chairs, we have 4 task forces to thank, by the way, the co-chairs who will help us in this endeavor. I'm glad that some of them will be with us today in the 2 sessions in which we delve into the key topics of these 4 task forces. When it comes to the agenda of the T7 Italy, we are now in the process of selecting the policy briefs and we're favoring co-authorship to integrate different views. We will further discuss the key topics of our policy briefs in spring roundtables, once more to include new voices and views. The final outcome will be the T7 communiqué, which will be presented in mid-May in the T7 summit in Rome, of course in view of the G7 summit in June. For further information, here you see in the last slide also our email address, so of course you can get in touch with us to contribute with events, with your voice, with your comments, with your integrations to G7, to this G7 and T7 Italy. So these are the structure and the agenda of the Think7 Italy, but for a closer look at the topics, let me now leave the floor to Ettore Greco. Ettore, I see you here. So Ettore, now the floor is yours. Please, Ettore.
So many thanks, Antonio. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, and many thanks for joining us today. This Inception conference, as most of you know, is a milestone event in this T7 process, as it offers a valuable opportunity to share views and inputs on how to structure our work in the most effective way and discuss the thematic priorities of the individual process. In a nutshell, our task is to help the G7 leaders develop the group's agenda by providing research-based recommendations. This is a demanding policy-oriented exercise, which includes several things: assess the state of implementation of past commitments, propose new instruments to implement them, identify possible new lines of action, and discuss strategies to build new forms of cooperation and partnership with third countries, other groupings, and international organizations. And indeed, in elaborating our proposal and recommendation, we need to take into account some challenges that the G7 is facing in an international environment which appears increasingly unstable and conflict-prone. The G7 has shown a considerable degree of cohesion in addressing crucial challenges such as Russia's aggression against Ukraine and in undertaking major initiatives to ensure economic security. But this convergence will no doubt continue to be tested. We should not forget that even issues such as climate and trade have been sources of considerable frictions from time to time in the G7 summit, not to speak also of relations with Russia and China, for instance, during the Trump presidency. Second, the G7 runs risk of being increasingly perceived just as a sort of steering group of the West, a restricted Western club, and indeed its role is contested or even openly opposed by several groups of countries, while its clear ambition is to provide the impulse for proposals and initiatives that can then become a matter of discussion in wider, enjoy also wider support in larger forum. This is not an easy proposition, as you know. Some measures on which the G7 has focused, including those aimed at de-risking economic security, are said or have been perceived as having adverse effect in many countries of the so-called Global South. This point to the need to reinforce and make more credible those parts of the G7 agenda that can provide a concrete basis for engagement and closer cooperation with developing countries, particularly Africa countries. There will be, as you know, the regional focus of the Italian presidency, as was confirmed yesterday at the summit with the African leaders here in Rome. To be up to this task, the G7 should demonstrate above all the capacity to further develop some initiatives that are of paramount importance in such fields as global health, multilateral debt restructuring, mitigation of the climate crisis, and global food security. A fundamental challenge that the G7 is facing is to align financial instruments to the objective it is committed to pursue in those fields, laying the groundwork for effective partnership with developing countries. It is a promising sign that the Italian presidency has been emphasizing these reach-out efforts towards Africa and more broadly the so-called Global South, and that in some fields, such as global health and food security, the Italian diplomacy has been in the last few years very active on this international field. I'm sure this G7 will make a significant contribution to the discussion of how the G7 can face those challenges, and not less important, its proposals and recommendations that we will present in our final conference in Rome will certainly offer useful inputs to the G7 leaders on the major issues they will discuss. I then very much look forward to our discussion today. Thank you again for accepting to take part in this dialogue. We count on your continued participation throughout the whole T7 process. Now, I have the great pleasure to give the floor for the keynote speech to Gianpaolo Cutillo, Deputy Director General and Principal Director for Global Issues on and G7, G20 processes at the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Please, Director Cutillo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Antonio and Ettore, for your opening remarks. Good morning, everybody from Rome. And thank you for inviting me to this launch of T7. Actually, thank you also for reminding us the challenges and opportunities that we have had as we start this Italian presidency of the G7. We definitely value and need your advice as the world is getting more complicated and making the G7 job not any easier. I will try to tell you where we are coming from and where we intend to go during our presidency. And then, of course, I'll be glad to listen to your inputs. Allow me to go back to 2021. We've been lucky in that year when we chaired the G20 when it mattered most, when the world was trying to come together during the pandemic to meet daunting health, labor, and social challenges and kickstart a moribund economy. No one doubted then that the G20, representing 85% of the world's GDP, 3/4 of world trade, and 2/3 of the world population, was where the solutions would come from. And the G7, at least on that occasion, to be honest, had to become a regional subgroup. But then we see how things change in just 2 years. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has paralyzed the G20 and split its membership. The group cannot agree on how to solve geopolitical crises, but it cannot make real progress on other issues either. So the BRICS and the G7 and their respective allies face off on every single item of the agenda and can at best reach last-minute compromises to allow the G20 live another day and hope for a better future. Meanwhile, the G7 has risen from the ashes. Overnight, it has become where liberal democracies coordinate their policies to contain autocracies, be it sanctions against Moscow or measures to counter economic coercion and debunk fake news and propaganda. The G7 is at the forefront of the West's efforts. Italy got lucky this year as well. We are chairing the G7 when again it matters most. We are aware of the very difficult task we are shouldering. It was complicated for Germany 2 years ago and for Japan last year, and it will be even more demanding this year. War is still raging, flashpoints are multiplying, and the economy has still to fully recover from the pandemic and subsequent disruptions. All the while, climate change and other urgent concerns are not going away, quite the opposite. We will carry on the good work of our predecessor on Ukraine, but also address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the threats to shipping in Red Sea, and rising tensions in the Middle East. But the G7 cannot function in crisis mode forever. It would fail its mission to seek long-term solutions to long-term problems. Italy intends, therefore, to do just that by tackling several priorities. The main one is Africa, the only continent where tumultuous demographic growth is still outstripping economic development and investments. The Italy-Africa Summit ended yesterday, and it's really been a great success. Prime Minister Meloni sketched out the Mattei plan and will gradually build on it to enhance Europe-Africa relations, as well as to relaunch a clear message of the G7 interest and openness to work with African nations. Africa, as Prime Minister Meloni said yesterday, is therefore to take a place of honor in our G7. We intend, in fact, to involve our G7 partners in our long-term plans for Africa. At the G7, we will focus on energy. Africa needs to harness its huge potential, especially in green energy production, to improve people's everyday life and allow business and industry to develop. Energy is the indispensable fuel for economic growth, which in turn is the only answer to all the other problems: instability, poverty, migration. Our G7 presidency will seek to mobilize large international financial resources to fill Africa's gap in energy infrastructure. And so it will be about wind farms, solar power plants, the grid, and all the rest. Africa has the means to produce energy, enough energy for itself, and export the surplus, in particular to Europe. ELMET, a 220-kilometer undersea cable between Tunisia and Sicily, will be ready by 2028 and will be a cornerstone of this strategy. Food security is a second priority. Italy, home to the UN agencies specialized in food issues, has a long history in this area. At the 2009 summit, the G7 approved the Aquila Food Security Initiative. At the G20 in 2021, the foreign and development ministers endorsed the Materia Declaration on Food Security, Nutrition and Sustainable Food System. This presidency will launch the Apulia Food Security Initiative at the Leaders Summit in June to address the food climate nexus and boost G7 commitments on food security and sustainable food systems. Last but not least, artificial intelligence, an issue Prime Minister Meloni and her G7 colleagues have taken to heart as they realize how its immense potential benefits could easily be outweighed by the risks AI poses to privacy, freedom of speech, job security, and ultimately, in a doomsday scenario, to our own liberty as human beings. The key words here are regulation, self-regulation, guidelines, best practices. Anything that can reassure the public that AI is under control and is not about to take over our lives. We must, in other words, ensure Technologies are developed at the service of humanity with clear ethical guardrails. It is early days, of course, and we understand that it is a crowded market. Other international and national bodies are trying to regulate AI. UNESCO, the Council of Europe, the EU, of course, the US administration and the US Congress, to name a few. The G7 could not remain silent. The Japanese presidency has done a lot last year with the Hiroshima AI principles and the code of conduct. We intend to build on that with a toolkit that would further help establish ethical rules on the design, development, and running of algorithms. Algorithmics, to use the new buzzword of our times. A final word on the need to reach out to other countries. The last 2 years have been an extraordinary time for diplomacy. Never since the end of World War II has the global order been more in disarray. Nations are again at risk of splitting into competing factions right when they should unite to fight existential threats such as climate change. So we think the G7 must rise above the fray and help mend bridges. We have the principles, the clout, and the means to lead by example and to convince others to follow, and to persuade our rivals that cooperation is better than competition. So Italy will try its best to engage with the G20 and beyond to ensure we return to a rules-based system of governance that benefits all. And with that, I thank you for your attention and leave the floor. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Minister Cutillo, for setting the stage of this meeting by presenting some key points of the agenda of the Italian presidency. We now move to the second part of our meeting, which will be devoted to discussing the issues that will be covered and addressed in the individual T7 task forces. And for the first panel, I'm now the pleasure to give the floor to Matteo Villa, researchers at ISPI. Please, Matteo, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome to the first session of this Think7 Inception conference, which we titled Security and the Economy More and More Intertwined. I mean, this discussion couldn't come at a better time as international community. We spent the first decades after the end of the Cold War in the prevailing belief that more interdependence would mean less conflicts. Countries that were more integrated in the global economy would have more to lose in case of conflict, and efficiencies in international trade and investment would make everyone better off. Skip a few decades, and the rise of China on the one hand, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the other, are making many countries reevaluate these beliefs. More people now recognize that interdependencies can also make countries more vulnerable on the security side, and that more international trade and investment can certainly make the average country and person better off, but for some groups of citizens, the effect will depend on what job they did, which sectors, etc. So global interdependencies generate winners and losers. So after a period where optimism tended to prevail and cooperation could still emerge in a fractured world, we now see more distrust than before. And many countries rushing to design their own remedies and countermeasures to this, which often means spending more on defense, on the one hand, and on the other, taking more protective measures on critical materials, on critical sectors, on trade and investment in general. So where is the world headed? To discuss this today, joining me are four outstanding international experts. They are the lead co-chairs and co-chairs of two of this year's task forces of the Think7. For the task force on peace, security, and global governance, joining us today is lead co-chair Antonio Missiroli, senior advisor at ISPI, my think tank. So welcome, Antonio. Let me also welcome one of the task force's co-chairs, Rachel Rizzo, who is senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to you as well.
For the task force on the future of the global economy, joining us today will be lead co-chair Carlo Altomonte, professor at Bocconi University and a senior associate at ISPI. And let me finally welcome Rose Ngugi, one of the task force's co-chairs, who is also executive director at KIPRA, the Kenya Institute for Public Research and Analysis. So you see them all at my side. So without further ado, let me start with Antonio Missiroli. So Antonio, can you tell us how the international security landscape is changing these days? Are there more conflicts? Are they getting harder to solve? And specifically on Ukraine, how are things going and how are Western allies approaching the conflict today?
Hello, Matteo, and good afternoon to everyone, or good morning, wherever you are right now. Yes, I mean, the landscape has changed and has changed dramatically over the past couple of years. Recent reports by two of the main think tanks devoted to international security, the International Institute for Security Studies, for Strategic Studies in London, has published a report whereby there are more than 180 conflicts of different kinds ongoing worldwide. And CIPRI in Stockholm has published another report highlighting the fact that there are more than 50 state-based conflicts in the world right now. In other words, there is an increasing recourse to violence and the use of military force to address controversies and grievances at the global level. There is also within this trend, if you like, a rising impact of new military kit and sophisticated technologies to maximize the harm that is being inflicted and to reduce direct exposure. And also against this is happening against the backdrop of growing strategic and even systemic competition bordering with rivalry. In this context, of course, the Russian aggression against Ukraine continues to represent the primary and defining conflict that the global West is confronted with. The aggression against Ukraine has reshaped our foreign security and defense policies, has redefined our postures and priorities, and has reset our relations with the rest of the world. And in this context, 2024, the year that is starting now, the year of the Italian presidency of the G7, is likely to represent a critical juncture in all this, in light of what I would define as four critical factors. The first one is the course of the conflict on the ground itself, which appears to be stuck in a sort of stalemate in which the superior critical mass that Russia can rely on and mobilize in terms of manpower, hardware, ammunition, and air capabilities could tip the balance in its favor. The second factor is the current uncertainty over continuing Western support to Ukraine, support in both financial and military terms. A third factor is the political unknowns that are stemming from the electoral processes that will occur in both Europe and the United States, which may well influence that support, and to some extent, I'm tempted to say, are already influencing it. And fourth and final factor is the indirect and possibly even direct impact of other conflicts, current and future, in other regional theaters from the wider Middle East and the Gulf to the Indo-Pacific, in terms of cumulative effects, both political and military, and even overlapping players. Just think of the role that Iran and North Korea are playing in the Russia-Ukraine conflict right now. All this, to conclude, requires a maximum of cohesion and resolve among the G7 countries, but also coupled with a readiness and an ability to reach out to other players at the global level, players that may not be entirely aligned with our democratic principles and values, for instance, but may share, and probably do share, our emphasis on certain rules of state behavior at the global level and our interest in upholding the so-called global commons in terms of freedom of navigation, international trade and supply chains, and even food security, let alone global challenges we are all aware of, like mitigating the effects of climate change and boosting renewable and clean sources of energy. All this will be also one of the foci of the task force on peace and security. And we have seen a number of abstracts to this effect that are very promising in this respect.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Antonio, for this overview. Very interesting, very important also to underline your task force work on the topic. So let me turn to Rachel, so one of your co-chairs. Rachel Rizzo, you're based in the US, in Washington, D.C., so you are watching the same developments unfolding from your own vantage point, let's say. Can you tell us what do you expect to happen? How will these, you told me in private, crazy electoral year affect how the US faces these mounting security challenges, and specifically how is its support to Ukraine changing, given that we already know that the US Congress has been delaying the approval of its $60 billion package for Ukraine for several months now?
Yeah, so you're right. The US is in a really interesting spot this year because we're in the middle of another presidential election where thus far, policy issues don't seem to be at the forefront of discussions. And I'll explain that. So Biden has had a very successful presidency thus far, but his economic accomplishments aren't really resonating with voters. His approval rating is low. So the election messaging that Biden is leaning toward is really reminiscent of this 22 message, which was, this is a fight for the soul of the nation. This is a fight for the future of democracy. On Ukraine specifically, we've seen Biden and his administration use the same language. This is a fight for democracy. Supporting Ukraine shows shows what kind of nation that we are as the United States, what kind of people we are as Americans, and so that we need to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. So that resonated for a while because of the role that the United States has historically played in the world. But once it became clear that this was not going to be a short war, it was not going to be easily won, we could be in this for a while. The weapons we're sending are holding Russia at bay, but Ukraine isn't making any major strategic gains like they did in 2022. It was then that Ukraine became a political football. The message for as long as it takes really no longer resonated. And what's interesting about this is that the divide isn't necessarily between Republicans and Democrats. The divide is more so between the more centrist, Reaganite wing of the Republican Party and what I and many other people refer to as the new right. It's a new type of American conservatism ushered in by Donald Trump that now has senators like Josh Hawley and J.D. Vance amongst its ranks and a huge intellectual machine behind it, like the America First Policy Institute and the Heritage Foundation. So the fact that Ukraine has found itself in the crosshairs of this inter-party fight is unfortunate, but it's a sign of the times. There's a lot of skepticism amongst the new right about U.S. commitments abroad, and they've done a really good job of tying domestic issues like the southern border to the continuation of funding for Ukraine. So as of now, there's still a deal trying to be worked out on Capitol Hill that would both better secure the southern border in the minds of the Republicans in exchange for continuing to fund Ukraine. The new right doesn't see this fight as one for the future of democracy, and it doesn't really matter that Ukraine is on the front lines protecting Europe. They might sympathize with their plight, but at the end of the day, the idea is that we need to take care of our own house first. So for classic liberals, I think this is it's concerning because it really calls into question the role the U.S. would play in the world if Donald Trump wins a second term, which I think is completely within the realm of possible. So then the question becomes, if U.S. support dwindles, where does that leave Europe in its own support? And ultimately, what does that mean for the future of the conflict and the U.S. role in multilateral institutions?
Totally, yes. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for this, let's say, setting the stage for the US's maybe comeback or not in the international scene, but of course, we'll see how this develops. Let me still turn to Carlo Altomonte now, because we are seeing these mounting challenges and the possibility maybe Trump's return makes some of these even more intractable. But Trump or not Trump in the US, all countries are taking more and more geopolitical stances on their attitudes towards trade, inward and even outward investment. So what do you make of this?
So, Matteo, thanks to all of you, and it's a pleasure and an honor being able to share with you and with the audience my thoughts. With the task force, we are working exactly on the future of the global economy, and we are trying to see to what extent geopolitics is having an impact on what has been with us for almost 25 years, which is the trend towards a larger integration of economic activity, what we call globalization in general. Now, globalization is a phenomenon that is not new to the world. We have had already at least 3 rounds of globalization, including the current one. And I'm saying the current one because I do not believe that this round of globalization is over. We had one with the British Empire first at the end of the 19th century, spanning until World War I. Then we had the second round of globalization after the end of World War II, where we had to deal with the post-colonial world in another era in which exchanges started to thrive under the Bretton Woods Agreement that stabilized exchange rates across countries and started to create a role for developing and emerging economies into the world arena. And then we had, of course, the Pax Americana, so to say, the post-Cold War, Cold War globalization, where the US emerged as a clear winner of the Cold War. Eastern Europe became part of European Union. China entered the WTO. And that has been associated in general to what has been insofar considered the largest integration of economic activity across countries, and has led to narratives like the end of history on the one end or the flat world on the other end. Things that we are now reconsidering because, as we saw and as our speaker before, Antonio and Rachel, told us, history and politics are not over, not at all, and they are playing an increasing role into the shaping of world affairs. Starting already with the Trump presidency and the US-China controversy on trade, which was out of the scope of whatever deal and rule of the World Trade Organization, and that paved the way then to the current, if you want, a round of events in which countries are more and more assertive on their national interest, sovereignty issues, strategic consideration that are shaping the way countries behave and deal with global issues, in particular trade liberalization and investment. Now, if we look at the data, we actually see that globalization has slowed down, measured by the extent of units of trade per unit of GDP. This is a very simple and rough indicator. There are more sophisticated indicators that look at the import content of domestic value added, or the import content of exports of countries. So if you work throughout the value chain, you avoid double counting, you do all sorts of statistical tricks to make sure to capture what is actually produced abroad and incorporated into a country production process. But all those measures are telling us that we had a huge increase of those numbers from the early 2000 up to the financial crisis, 2010, then some slowdown, some recovery, and then flattening until right now. So people believe that, okay, this is maybe not the end of globalization, but for sure the economists coin this word slowbalization, so we're in slow growth in trade. And with the fear that under an already slowed down extent of economic integration, plus this geopolitical consideration of countries, the fear that the global order can be fragmented and go back to, let's say, the national borders or the protectionist era that was already characterizing the period after the end of the first globalization, after the end of the globalization of the British Empire. Now, two things are, however, important to remember that are in the data. So these are facts that maybe people tend to forget, but in the end, we have to deal with reality, which is not a special case of theory. So the first fact is that those global numbers of slowdown of globalization can be decomposed into the world index with China and the world index without China. If you take out China of the measure of globalization, globalization has never stopped, has never slowed down. Actually, globalization, meaning by that the increasing integration of production processes of countries, has actually increased more or less at a constant pace throughout. Yes, a bit faster between 2000 and 2010, but for sure, not the dramatic slowdown that we have seen in the second period after 2010, if we exclude China from the numbers. So basically, if you want a title that makes the news, China is responsible for the slowdown of globalization at the world level. Why? Because China is moving from an emerging economy to an advanced country, and it's pretty much normal that in that there's nothing to blame. You switch from a higher reliability on import content than re-exported to domestic production, higher value added, and higher incorporation into your domestic market, which is expanding of imports that you take from abroad. So basically, the openness of China has decreased and is reaching, it was twice the openness of the US or Europe, and now it's reaching the same degree of openness slowly, the same degree of openness of Europe or the US, which is between 15 and 18% of trade over GDP. China used to be 30. When China, which is roughly a fourth of the global economy, slows down and becomes more closed, then the entire global economy slows down in terms of openness. That makes perfect sense. So on the one hand, we have to then realize that production processes keep on being very much integrated, China or not. And without China, they are as integrated as they used to be in the past, which challenges the conventional wisdom of the so-called strategic autonomy. And that is a word that we hear a lot in Europe or even in the US, saying that we want to disentangle for the world production in order to be more reliant on our own resources, in order to be in control of our own source of destiny. Strategic autonomy is a dream, which is impossible to achieve, because the numbers are telling us that, if anything, the world production is becoming more and more integrated, like it or not, with or without China. More, China, even if it's becoming less integrated with the world economy or relatively more close to the world economy, still hub of a number of central value chains. True, there are diversification strategies in places. There are strategies with which foreign capital is leaving China and going somewhere else. There are strategies of China plus one, so where you have your key suppliers in China and in another country to build resilience. You have strategies so-called of China for China, so where you invest in China only for the domestic market of China, not for the key supplying of key intermediates. But in the end, this is a very long process. So the real measure that we have to consider as a viable plan for advanced economies, if you want to incorporate strategic consideration into global value chain consideration, is that the mantra of strategic diversification rather than strategic autonomy. Autonomy is impossible to achieve, is extremely costly, and is probably even not convenient from a strategic point of view. So we look with a lot of favor of what is happening in those days, for example, in Italy yesterday, where European leaders have met African leaders in order to try to involve more and more Africa into the European value chains. That's the way to go. That's the way to start a process of strategic diversification that might, let's say, put together and reconcile consideration of efficiency in global production with consideration of geopolitical interest for the European continent. Other strategies in which you go alone, you go sovereign, you go national are essentially impossible to achieve. This is what the numbers are telling us, like it or not.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you so much. Of course, we've seen, especially in the last part of strategic diversification, you mentioned Africa. So let me turn now to Rose Ngugi from Kipra. So Rose, you focus on what's happening in Africa and its relations with the West, for instance. So here in Italy, we just finished our hosting the Italy-Africa Summit, as our Sherpa mentioned, which aims at fostering closer cooperation with countries in the continent. But this cooperation sometimes can seem pretty far away, right? So let me ask you, we often hear that the world is awash in debt, that many African countries are struggling with renegotiating it, and they really struggle, and they have many of them have come to close to defaulting or defaulted in the recent past. So can you give us a picture of what's happening? And let me just remind all our guests to try to stick to our 5-minute time for answering, so that we all have time to do a second round. Thank you so much. So Rose, what do you make of this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Matteo. It's nice to be in this meeting, and of course, launching our the Inception conference for the think tank 7. So on the matters to do with debt, I think it's an animal that is really gaining a different shapes. But for Africa, debt is actually rising at a very fast rate. By 2022, we were at about 65% of GDP. And one may argue that even at 65%, maybe we are still at a lower level compared to 1995, where we were about 89% when the HIPIC element was coming in. But to look at the debt at the moment is to say that a significant factor that is contributing to this is the high cost of servicing debt. If you compare Africa interest payments, which account to about 3.2% of GDP, and you look at what the developed countries are servicing their debt with, which is about 1.5%, then you'll obviously see that for African countries, there is really an increasing pressure on fiscal space, which is already very, very small. And it means that they are actually diverting part of the resources that would grow them in food security, in energy production, and all those things. They are focusing actually on payment of debt. Further is also to say that the debt has actually changed over time. There's quite a heavy burden coming from the non-concessional debt, which is about 40%, or the private creditor is about 40% of the total debt. And we also have seen that a lot of the bilateral trade debt is moving away from the traditional Paris Club arrangements to the non-Paris Club arrangement. And in this context of debt restructuring, this is actually making it a little bit complex, because without a clear coordination between the Paris Club and the non-Paris Club, then it makes the restructuring becomes a little bit delayed or even not achieve what is being looked for. More importantly, is about the middle income countries. For a long time, we didn't have problems about debt levels with the middle income countries. But right now, middle income countries are feeling the heat of debt distress. And an example is two of the lower middle income countries in the region have actually defaulted in payment of their tax and of their debt, and they are actually undergoing the common framework, the G20 common framework, which means that they are already restructuring the debt factor. The debt service suspension was welcome. Was a very good welcomed move, which came in 2020, and we saw a decrease in the debt level. But to remind you is that 31 out of the 47 countries that took up the DSS were from Africa, and things have not changed as much because among the many countries that have that took up this DSSI, four of them are actually going through the, three of them are actually going through the common framework, which means that, yes, there was a release, there was an ease in the debt burden, but it was not sustainably taken through. Currently, 8 countries are in debt distress, and 13 are actually in high risk of debt distress. More importantly is also to think about the financial conditions at the global level, and looking at how African countries are able to raise funds from the capital market. And what you'll find that in the recent past, 2022, 2023, is just a very few of the countries have actually managed to float a bond at the international market. And this is coming against a situation where many of the countries are actually seeing their credit rating being downgraded, which means that as they get to the market, they're also facing very high interest. A lot, and it's good to appreciate that, a lot has gone on in terms of easing the burden. We have seen, for example, the multilateral bodies like IMF and the others, they have tried to modify their emergency funds. For example, you find the rapid finance instruments. We increase the access rate, and this is continuing all the way to June this period. We have also seen, for example, the stage 1 of the fundraising has closed the subsidy loan and the resource gap in the PRGT. But then there is still a question on how we can align the access remit of the PRGT with the GRA, which was increased for 12 months last year. In addition, if you look at the 16th general review of quota, I think there was a lot of expectations that something big could come out of it. But what has come out of it is just the fact that the quotas have been increased by 50%. But you're increasing the quotas by 50%, but without aligning the quota formula. It means that it's like increasing an intercept, which means that countries just remain with the same voting rate. But of course, it's a good welcomed move because at least the African countries can actually have an increased access by the fact that their quota level has actually gone up. So going forward, there are quite a number of things that I'm going to talk about, but I think my 5 minutes have gone, and I'll come back later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, so we still have 20 minutes on our hands, so maybe if I can ask the speakers to stick to 3 to 4 minutes for their answers, we will certainly manage to do our second round. So thank you so much, Rose, for this. It's very important to discuss debt distress and debt relief for African countries at the G7 level, and so I'll come back to that. But let me now go back to Europe and to harder security questions. So Antonio Miseroli, again, you told us how you see things going in terms of conflicts as we live through this electoral year as well. But what do you think that the European countries should do for their own defense and to guarantee their own security? Also taking into account the progressive detachment of the US from the European continent that we might expect and we've seen happening in the past.
Well, a few minutes ago, Rachel highlighted the shift that is occurring in the domestic political debate in the United States about its role in the world, and in particular, possible role in European security. And I think it is a definite prospect, the one whereby we might see a progressive American disengagement or lesser engagement in European security due to domestic political decisions and domestic priorities, or to global demands and constraints on global security. And I think Europeans had to start preparing seriously for this contingency. The current situation is not going to last forever. This probably requires first and foremost to strengthen and add the fresh substance to the idea of a European pillar inside the Atlantic Alliance. There will be a summit in Washington in July to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the alliance, and I think that should be an important opportunity for Europeans to get their act together and add substance to this, as I said, very old idea, with the possibility of a a EU own contribution to all that. It is a fact that Europeans have increased defense spending over the past couple of years, the highest year-on-year rise since the end of the Cold War. And a number of common initiatives have been launched also at EU level to support Ukraine in its defense against the Russian aggression. But there are a number of challenges. I mean, there is no time to elaborate too much on that. One is defense spending, raising defense spending must be sustained over the years in order to build up capabilities, but also in order to give certainty of orders to the defense industry. Otherwise, it is impossible to increase our capabilities in the first phase. It needs prioritization. We should not continue spreading our limited resources too thin on a number of different projects, sometimes competing with one another. And that requires, to some extent, joint capability development, the ability, in other words, to produce economies of scales, but also sort of multiplier effects on capabilities that would increase both Europe's own capabilities in that respect, but also, as I said, the European pillar in NATO, in order to be able to confront the Russian threat and other threats that may emerge in the future with the adequate resources.
Thank you so much, Antonio. This is very important, and it's actually brings us neatly to connects us neatly with Rachel. Let me come back to you and to how the US sees the world. We have talked now at length about Europe and the current conflict in Ukraine, but especially US-Europe relationships. And so the obvious elephant in the room in all these conversations is the relationship between America and China. So we know that this has changed very little from one president to another over the past decade or so. Beijing appears to be willing to become the inevitable contender to American primacy, and the US appears to be intending to tackle that. So what's your take on this, and how might this affect maybe relationships within the G7?
So in the US today, I think it's hard to overstate just how much the China question has overtaken discourse in terms of broader geopolitics. It's no longer just about China's role in the Indo-Pacific or how to reorient the US military so that it might be better able to deter an attack on Taiwan. Although the military is certainly focused on this, and we've seen major investments in, for example, the US Navy, but the China question goes much deeper than that, simply because of how intertwined domestic policy is with economic statecraft. So when you look at things like the Inflation Reduction Act, Build Back Better, the CHIPS and Science Act, these are all focused on boosting the US at home, especially boosting the US manufacturing sector, with the ultimate goal, of course, of countering China and being able to better compete with China, although those parts aren't said as loudly. Similarly, when you look at how the US is refocusing some of its attention on the global South, I think it's waking up to the realization that the US has looked at Africa, for instance, as a continent full of risks, where China has looked at it as a land of opportunity and has invested thusly for the last 20 years. And the US is kind of trying to counter that by striking hundreds of deals with different African nations over the past year. And moving beyond Africa, I think there's a big question of what happens in the economic security space if Donald Trump is reelected, and what that means for our relationship with Europe, for instance. We all know that he thinks that the EU was created to economically undermine the United States, and that he imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on the EU during his presidency. But at the same time, it's not just about Donald Trump. President Biden's foreign policy for the middle class is a similar message to America first, but includes obviously better relations with longstanding US partners and allies. So I think it's interesting to watch the intersection of domestic, foreign, and economic policy continue to grow and deepen, and how that might end up affecting US actions and relationships abroad ultimately.
Thank you, Rachel, for this. And so let me go back to the, say, softer side of confrontations, because Carlo, you told us about, we just saw the US-China confrontation rising, but you told us in the end, globalization is continuing to, move if you exclude China as well, especially. And so how do we reconcile these two facts between, increasing confrontation on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that globalization is continuing to go on? Are countries simply unwilling to put a stop to it, or are afraid of it, or are we not seeing the most important facts of this, let's say, return of geopolitics into the economic side of the equation yet? So what's your take on this?
No, I think what Rachel just said is interesting because it shows a potential solution. I mean, we all realize. I mean, if you look at the IRA, the Build Back Better, the CHIPS Act, and also the Green Deal industrial policy in Europe, they are all policies that are meant to disengage our production capacity from China, basically, and diversify better. Now, the question is that serves the purpose of reshaping globalization in a way that is less dependent on one single actor, and therefore serves better our national interests. The point is that requires a certain degree of coordination between those countries that want to do so, because if they all start differentiating away from China and then competing for the same set of diversification, think about strategy towards Africa, for example, or South America, we would end up with a worse deal and a worse situation that we would have otherwise. Think about the IRA. The IRA could be seen as a protectionist policy in the US, which only serves the American first interest at the detriment of European, for example, companies, because there is an incentive for European companies to move to the US and abandon Europe, answering those incentives. But that's not really the case, because if you really think at the way the IRA has been shaped up, European companies can access some of those incentives, but also by serving US market through Europe, through inputs of Europe. So there are a number of loopholes in the system that allow, and there is work at the level of EU and US to coordinate things in such a way that the expansion of a domestic demand on manufactured goods in the US would be a positive thing for EU producers, and the other side, the Green Deal industrial policy should be such that US might have an interest in developing some of their companies and activities in the European market. This is, after all, why we have still the G7, because that requires a very high level of coordination in terms of industrial policies, in terms of financial policies, in terms of trade policies between advanced nations that have decided jointly to see in a less, let's say, risky way the pattern of globalization, which is, as I said, technologically very unavoidable. It's not that tomorrow you flip a switch and you decide that you disentangle. You can differentiate better, you can differentiate away from China or any other country per se, but you don't want to have one node critical in the system that is not under your own control. That makes sense. So in order to build resilience in the global system, you need to differentiate in a smart way. And coordinating, in particular, EU and US policies towards emerging markets is possibly the best way of achieving a win-win outcome that would at the same time reconcile that technological need to keep a global production process with the political need of defending our own interests.
Makes total sense. Thank you, Carlo, for this, and maybe also for some positive views of both the resilience of globalization at this stage and the fact that there are solutions for cooperation as well. And so let me turn to Rose, because we talked about Africa and the, let's say, rising debt and the fact that current tools are not enough. So maybe my question for you would be, which tools do you think would be necessary, both at the G7 or G20 level? What could the G7 do to maybe enhance cooperation on debt relief, debt distress, debt renegotiation? As we know, as you told us, that in the end the Paris Club has a less of a sway, and let's face it, China has more on bilateral debt, especially public bilateral debt with these countries. So what is your take on this?
Yeah, thank you very much again. I think, first of all, is to say that G7 really has a major role that it can play It is actually in various platforms where it engages with Africa. For example, G7 is a member of G20, and the AU is now a member of G20, a permanent member. Secondly, all members of G7, they're actually members of, they are non-regional members of African Development Bank, which means that even at that level, G7 can actually make a difference for Africa. G7 also controls over 40% of the voting rights in an institution like the IMF, which means that in the discussions that are going on, including what is now going to be on the table for the 17th January review of the quota formula, it means that G7 can actually put a voice for Africa, including how we can align the quota formula such that it helps those in need actually to also get more resources, including like the FDR allocations. There's been a talk that MDBs, for example, African Development Bank, can get a share of the same so that it can be used by the regional countries. So actually G7 has platforms that it can actually be able to support the agenda for debt for Africa. Secondly, as AU or Africa in general, there are quite a number of initiatives that have been taken to enhance debt management, as well as, of course, ease the debt burden. And one of things of the proposal that is on the table is having what we call the Africa Debt Monitoring Mechanism, so that we can increase transparency in debt reporting and avoid the growing hidden debt that is complicating the negotiations for debt treatment. Given the position that G7 stands, this is an area that it can actually support operationalization of such a mechanism. Secondly, for the ADB, there is a proposal to have what we call the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism that is meant to complement the global safety nets, for example, those that are offered by IMF, by offering a liquidity support for countries in times of crisis. And for this reason, G7 is a non-regional member of ADB. It can actually sit in to really see that such a safety net can actually come to fruition. The other thing that African AU is actually looking at is kind of setting up an Africa credit rating agency. With the downgrading of credit rating recently, there are some noises that sometimes the objectivity is not found, and probably having an alternative for credit rating for the African countries could help them actually to access the international markets and also have investors interested in the region. So these are initiatives under the AU, under Africa, and in various positions that the G7 is networking with the African region. And finally, is the fact that African leaders have been looking for a way of strengthening the common framework. We know even the 4 countries that have gone through it, not only have they seen some delays, but also there is a lot of uncertainty on where you start and where you end. How do you treat the debt payment during the time that you're going through the common framework negotiations? And so G7 supporting kind of creating a more inclusive multilateral credit club that accommodates the pari and non-pari clubs. It can help actually to make things work easier for the common framework, because as we talk now with very many countries on high debt distress, we don't know how many others would be coming to look for debt relief through this kind of framework. And then finally, we know that G7 and especially even Italy, it has under the EU, there is that relationship that is happening between them. And through that relationship, maybe it's time to look at strategic actions that need to be taken so that the middle-income countries and the trap that they're finding themselves at the moment, they'll be able to get out of it. I like that energy infrastructure is being given a high priority, and probably we can look at it as a way of ensuring there is a growth sustainability that will bring down the debt element in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you also because you underlined not just the help that these countries might give for debt redress and the renegotiation, but also the support for market access in order to ensure more resilience for these countries. So it's very interesting going forward, looking at the proposals that will come out of these two task forces. Let me wrap up. We're actually early than expected. So let me thank the speakers of this panel, not just for their very, very interesting remarks, but also for sticking for the time and for letting an Italian say, hey, we're early for once. So let me again thank you all and wrap this session up. And let me leave the floor for the second session of the Think7 Inception Conference about the twin transitions, climate and digital. Let me leave the floor to Fabrizio Botti.
Thank you. It's been great.
Is that okay in terms of audio, right? I'll do it again. Welcome to the second panel of the Inception Conference of the T7 Italy, titled A Green and Digital Future, Navigating the Twin Transitions. This panel involves some of the members of two task forces of the T7 Italy, Task Force 2 on Energy, Climate, and Sustainable Development, and Task Force 4 on the Science and Digitalization for a Better Future. Both task forces cover key priority areas in the G7 agenda, and more broadly, in global governance. Task Force 2 on Energy, Climate, and Sustainable Development cover a wide range of policy areas ranging from energy transition and security, climate policy and finance, migration policies, SDGs and development, food security, and global health. Regarding Task Force 4 on Science and Digitalization for a Better Future, its main policy areas include digital infrastructure and connectivity, artificial intelligence, data governance, technology platforms, and on the job market of technological transformation, and the role of innovation for sustainable human and inclusive development. Then how do we navigate this twin transition in 2024? On the one hand, recent geopolitical tensions and geoeconomic fragmentations are threatening an already challenging green and digital transition. On the other hand, the transition to a carbon neutral economy fosters the adoption of new technologies in many, and this is happening in many industries, and eventually complicates the trade-off between strategic dependencies and security emerging, especially in this phase of globalization, as it was discussed in the first panel of this event. Advancing meaningful and actionable policy recommendation for the G7 Italy will be crucial for the group of chairs and experts involved in the T7 process, and in these two task forces especially, we will discuss these key topics with 4 panelists, 4 international experts. Let me introduce them. by starting from Dario Scarnapieco. Dario Scarnapieco is the lead co-chair of Task Force 2. Scarnapieco is Chief Executive Officer and General Manager of Cassa Depositi e Prestiti from July 2023. He's also President of the European Long-Term Investors Association, formerly Vice President at the European Investment Bank and also Chairman of the European Investment Fund. Thank you very much and welcome to Dario Scarnapieco. Then let me also introduce Anna Katerina Ornich, Director at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS, formerly the IE, and Professor of Global Sustainable Development at the University of Bonn. Before joining the IDOS, the IE, in 2020, she was Professor of Social Science in the Maritime Tropics at the University of Bremen and have the Department of Social Sciences at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research in Bremen. Then we're honored to have Francesco Profumo, Chairman of Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo, Professor of Electrical Machines at the Polytechnic Turin and former Minister of Education, University and Research. Profumo is currently Chairman of ACRI and of Fondazione Bruno Kessler, President of the Business School of ECCP and President of the College of Engineers. Last but not least, of course, Chloe Tivan, Head of Digital Economy and Governance at the European Center for Development and Policy Management, ECDPM, in Brussels. Chloe was formerly an independent consultant and worked within the Moroccan Institute for Policy Analysis, the British Embassy in Cairo, and the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, among others. Position. Thank you all for being here. I would like to start with Dario Scarnapieco, a first round of more general questions. Scarnapieco, what is your perspective on the current challenges and opportunity that are facing the investment on energy transition and climate change? And how is CDP, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, supporting the Italian economy on this journey towards decarbonization? Over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, many thanks. Let's say that in the last few years, the world has confronted a lot of challenges, multidimensional challenges. And in the period from 20 to 2022, there has been a slight regression in the progress made on various sustainable development goals. When we're talking about energy, we know that the issue of security of supply has become, due to the war in Ukraine and also the crisis in the Middle East, as important as the issue of green transition. So there are challenges, but we also know that the situation presents important opportunities. In 2022, global investments in energy transition technology reached a new record equal to $1.3 trillion, which is a 70% growth if compared to 2019. Clearly, the trend is positive. International investment in renewable energy sector has nearly tripled since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement in 2015. However, annual global investment in clean technology would need, at least in the short term, to quadruple to keep on track meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. So we have seen an increase, but we are not still at the level in which we should be. At the European level, the Commission estimates a considerable need for additional investment, around 2% of GDP, to achieve the objectives of the European Green Deal. And of course, the energy crisis and the REPowerEU program have further increased the objectives to be achieved. Currently, the annual financial needs at the EU level are estimated to be more than 600 billion euro up to 2030. Now, in line with the EU commitment, you know that 38% of the Italian Recovery and Resilience Plan estimated expenditure is oriented towards climate objectives, and moreover, the Italian economic system is fully committed towards environmental sustainability, since Italy, for instance, is the 6th global exporter of renewable energy and is the 2nd European producer of renewable technologies. So while the national context is promising, the National Energy and Climate Plan underscores the necessity for an additional investment of 217 billion euro to achieve the environmental targets. Now, what is the role of CDP in the green transition? As you know, CDP is the Italian national promotional institution, and we play a very important role in supporting the Italian economy on its path toward decarbonization. Now, if we look at the climate change, I think that we should divide it in two. You know, we have climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. Adaptation is very much needed in Italy, if you consider the flooding in Romagna the last summer. So extreme weather events are becoming more frequent, and this means that we need to reinforce the resilience of the land. I mean, essentially of the territory. Moving to mitigation, I think that we can see it on essentially three angles. Four angles. The four angles are the following one: renewable energy, and we are essentially supporting all renewable projects in Italy. Moreover, we have a dedicated company together with IAI, which is committed. Of course, IAI is an older company which is committed towards a green transition plan, and so we are directly investing through this company, but we're also financing other renewable plants made by other private promoters. So renewable energy is very important. Equally important is energy efficiency. You know, energy efficiency can be compared to other source of energy. So we see that there is a lot of potential to save energy by adopting an energy efficiency plan, and we are working with many public administration to implement energy efficiency plan. The third angle, so renewable energy, energy efficiency, the third angle is having a system which of the grid, I would say, the distribution and the and batteries and storage, which are very effective. I believe the digitalization of the Italian transmission and distribution network of energy has proven to be extremely positive and efficient, because it allows not to overload the network and to optimize the utilization of energy on the network itself, and then therefore also the generation of energy is optimized. We are the owner of the national transmission company, which is called Terna, and we are investing a lot in technology to make sure, first of all, that there is a rapid connection of the solar plant or renewable energy plant, but also that there is a lot of digitalization and that this grid becomes really smart. The fourth angle and the final one is also very important, which is innovation. Clearly, a few days ago, I was asked whether there is a revolution, or is it an evolution or a revolution, the green transition. I said, unfortunately, at present is an evolution, because we do not have a revolutionary technology which allows things to speed up. But we want to invest in innovation, in new nuclear small modular reactors, in other sources of energy, because energy is clearly one part. Innovation is clearly part of energy. Therefore, we are of the entire plan to decarbonize. So we are the largest investor in venture capital in Italy. We are supporting funds which are dedicated to green transition, and therefore, to complete again the scenario, we definitely need more innovation, and Cassa Depositi e Prestiti is extremely active in supporting research centers, incubators, technology transfer fund, but also venture capital fund, to make sure that new technologies are developed to tackle these challenges. So in my view, this is the way in which we should see this item. Moreover, we have adopted strong policies to reduce the carbon footprint of our loan portfolio, and also we try always to push in the company in which we invest or that we support financially the idea of green transition. So we want to finance companies which are involved in a plan to decarbonize their activity.
Thank you very much, Canapiero, for sharing your view, your perspective on dealing with this twin transition. And speaking about that, I will turn to Anna Katarina Ornic, another member of your task force to energy, climate, and sustainable development. Anna Katarina Ornic is a co-chair in this task force, and I would like to ask you, Anna Katarina, in a context of geopolitical fragmentation, as we already discussed in the first panel, and of our worsening debt crisis in the global south, how is it possible to jointly address these two objectives of addressing climate crisis and dealing with the energy transition, not only in the developed countries or in the G7 bloc, but also in emerging and low-income countries? Considering the necessity for cooperation north-south when dealing with these challenging objectives. Over to you, Anna Katarina. Thanks.
Thank you, Fabrizio, and thank you for the kind invitation to this panel, to this important conference, but especially also to the overall process this year as part of the Think7 advisory process. I very much appreciate the cooperation. Now, with regard to the role of global cooperation, I think, first of all, it is important to underline that we've seen over the past years an increasing use and combination of a number of different multilateral forums for thematic alliances that range around the battle against climate change, as well as the pushing forward of the energy transition. And I think that combination of using the COPs, the climate COPs, using the G7, using the G20, as well as, of course, again and again, also drawing legitimacy out of the Agenda 2030, and with this drawing on the UN processes, is an important process to watch, because we see basically thematic alliances being built and shaped by multi-actor arrangements. And here I do want to just point to 4 elements also of developments that, of course, will accompany us through the year. First of all, the decision of transitioning away from fossil fuels from, of course, the COP28 in UAE, I think, creates an important basis also at a time of, you mentioned already, multiple crises of geopolitical tensions. At the previous panel, you were discussing also China relations. So I think that agreement to indeed transition away from fossil fuels has to be mentioned. But I think it's also important to realize it goes hand in hand with a general or very strong understanding in many middle and lower income economies and countries that this transitioning away will only work if social questions are tackled at the same speed, and that poverty is being addressed, but also the high levels of inflation and, of course, the debt crisis that is unfolding since a number of years. And if you take this now into the reflection of the G20 presidency of Brazil, I think it is important to keep here in mind that while we have a situation where also President Lula has lifted the battle against climate change, the battle against the biodiversity crisis, but also the transitioning of our energy systems into his presidential program, he also has made very, very clear that while he's a strong defender of the Paris Agreement, his the social questions, especially also within the Amazon region, have to be addressed. He's made that very clear. Before Christmas, he visited Berlin. He made very clear to our chancellor that the afforestation-free supply chain discussions on the European Union level, but also on the German federal government level, are considered, or he considers them, as hegemonic and neo-colonial. These are the words he also used. So it was very clear, while he is one of a very strong defender of the battle against climate change and moving towards this transitioning away from fossil fuels, if it comes down to the securing of livelihood, also especially in the Amazon region, he will stand on the side of his voters. So I think that has to be taken into account also when we now then take the next step and reflect on the possibilities to also this year again potentially bridge the G7 and G20, or basically find ways of drawing on both platforms to strengthen each other in moving towards a further transitioning away and phasing out. Now, let me just say a few more words on the German level. Here I want to point to a newly released strategy by the federal government of Germany that is called the Strategy on Climate Foreign Policy. I'll just hold it into the camera here. Anyway, it came out, was released just before Christmas. And I think what is important here to sort of maybe carry into the discussions is that this strategy very much works with the past discussions on the level of the G7 and the G20, on the level of a number of climate negotiations. So mainly COP26 is a reference point here. And then basically tries to build on these in order to further build energy partnerships and partnerships for climate stabilizing transitions. And that, of course, will be now interesting to see how how Germany within the European Union context and within the context of the G7 under Italian leadership, of course, can contribute to the building of the bridges between G7 and G20, or basically draw on both platforms to push the energy transition forward. I would also argue that, of course, the element that we are in a year of elections will mix that up a little further, not just thinking of the European Union or US elections, but also especially those elections across the African continent, South Africa, of course, Senegal, Ghana, but also, of course, Asia, meaning India, Indonesia, as big players. And a number of elections have already taken place in the Asian context. So that will be a very, very important year now to watch, to see how these upcoming platforms, again, of course, within the G7, G20 context, but also the COP context, can be used in that volatile environment of elections. I want to, as a last point to, of course, a summit of the future that focuses some of the discussions this year as well, not focused on the energy transition, but focused around, of course, the wider Agenda 2030. And in order to also support that process, there will be a conference also being organized by the German government in Hamburg in October, which might, which has the ambition at least to also put energy and climate partnerships and just transition energy partnerships, the JETP developments, into the center amongst other topics. With this, I hand back to you, Fabrizio. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna Katarina Ornage, for pointing out to the need to consider and also exploit potential synergies to build synergies with other fora, with other multilateral initiatives and commitments that are ongoing during the Italian presidency of the G7. I would like to turn now to Francesco Profumo, lead co-chair of Task Force 4 on Science and Digitalization for a Better Future. The title of the panel refer explicitly to the twin transition. This is the central topic of this panel, but since long time, Profumo, you suggest to expand the scope of the analysis as we are going to multiple transitions. And what is your view on the possible interaction between these multiple transitions at times of increasing uncertainty and, as we said, geopolitical fragmentation? Over to you, Professor Profumo. Excuse me, Professor Profumo, if you can turn on your microphone. I think we are having issues.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, great.
Nice. Thank you very much for your questions and for the interesting topic. First of all, let me start to emphasize the fact that we are facing at least 4 interconnected transitions and not only one. The first one is the environmental transition, and the policymakers have the responsibility to design strategies that contribute to reduce anthropogenic footprint, to mitigate the pressure on natural ecosystem, and to hand over to future generation a safe planet. But the time is over. The Earth is undergoing in an irreversible way, and the change is from to the global warming. Second, the digital transition. It's well known that the technology has the potential to accelerate the environmental transition by leveraging new solutions as an enabler to change. To give a few examples, think about smart grids, digital twins, energy audit software, Earth observation systems, or precision farming. But furthermore, in order to support the effects of environmental transition, we have to consider the social impact. There is a deep need to protect the most vulnerable people. But at this time, don't forget the wide range of opportunities in front of us. According to the latest strategy foresight report by the European Commission, around 1 million new jobs will be generated in Europe by the year 2030, while transforming existing ones to be more sustainable. Last but not least, there is no real change without cultural transitions. Daily experience teaches us that we live in an era where transformation has become exponential, accelerated, and uncertain. In particular, after the COVID-19 pandemic, we have to all understood that the disruption in the new normal and future is no longer a projection of the past. To prepare our society to face new black swans, a learn-to-learn approach is required. Coming back to school several times during our career and acquiring new competencies in an upskilling and reskilling perspective. Finally, there is another topic I would like to share with you today. Transition play an important geopolitical role. Global top economies are setting their strategies to protect themselves against critical issues of the current scenario. The war in Ukraine, the war in Middle East, the Red Sea crisis, the increasing tension between China and Taiwan. Globalization, regionalization, and friendshoring are the new key phenomena. This is why many measures have been introduced in a recent year. The Fit for 5 packaging and the Critical Raw Material Act in Europe, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. I also invite you to consider that the year 2024 will be an unprecedented election year. More than half of the world's citizens across more than 60 countries will go to the polls. At the end of the year, we may have a different world than we have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Profumo, for driving us through these different phases of transitions we are going through and that we have to take into consideration. I now turn to another member of your task force 4 co-chair, Chloe Tevan. Chloe, what do you think could be the role of digital infrastructure and connectivity, one of the main policy area of the G7, T7 agenda, and their implication for the green climate transition? Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. Maybe just to take a step back, I would like to focus particularly on also on the kind of on the global dimension, but I do think that we need to start with what is happening in the global north, and with the fact that we have a huge amount of investments taking place, and there is this sense of a race, a subsidy race when it comes to both the digital and to green infrastructure. This is quite important context for the remarks that I want to make, which are very much about how the G7 approaches the rest of the world. Firstly, on the topic of digital infrastructure specifically, and then secondly, with respect to the twin transitions and to the interlinkages between green and digital infrastructure. So I do think that it's very important at this moment in time that we do mention that this language on the twin transitions and this focus on the twin transitions, which is very, very strong in Europe in particular, but also that the Biden administration and others, other G7 members have been quite strong on. This language is not as much accepted in countries across the world. And also there is less of a, I think there is more work that needs to be done in terms of understanding what the twin transition means in different contexts and what are the priorities in very different contexts. I also just want to again reiterate that with the IRA, with the CHIPS Act in the US, and with the EU CHIPS Act and the COVID reconstruction package, etc., there has been a focus on subsidizing green and digital industries in Europe and the US, in part to compete with China, but that most countries across the global south haven't been able to put the same kinds of resources into subsidizing these technologies, and subsidizing the wider infrastructure that is necessary in order to take advantage of these transitions. So moving on from there, I do think that it's very important that the G7 has prioritized infrastructure partnerships, and particularly through the EU's Global Gateway and the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. There is this focus on partnering on infrastructure with countries across the world, and particularly like-minded developing and emerging economies. I want to touch firstly briefly on digital technology specifically, because there is a strong geopolitical incentive to invest in digital technology, but actually to date, the actual investments have been relatively limited, and the G7 members are actually struggling to compete with China in terms of investments, particularly in connectivity. There's a strong focus in the EU's Global Gateway, for example, on investing in digital connectivity in Africa, for example. But this is an area where there's very little past experience, and where it's taking a long time to scale up investments. So it will be very important that going forward, there's a strong focus on how to actually follow through on promises in this area, and not just make big announcements around big initiatives that are difficult to actually follow through on. So I would say that an important element this year will be to become a more credible partner in this area. That said, it's clear that not all G7 members will be able to invest in all areas. And I think we saw yesterday with Meloni's announcements around the Mattei plan that Italy has chosen, for example, 5 specific areas where it hopes to invest more deeply with respect to its relationship with Africa. So the areas that were mentioned were energy, water, agriculture, education and training, and health. And as has already been alluded to, particularly in those areas with respect to the twin transitions, there are many ways in which digital technologies can actually play a role. And President Meloni actually mentioned, for example, that satellite technologies can play a role in agricultural projects, as in the project in Algeria that she alluded to. So it will also be essential that when it comes to investments in green technologies, that the full potential of digital technologies and of emerging AI can actually be used to ensure that infrastructure investments in climate, in energy, and in agriculture are efficient and achieve their goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chloe, for starting to explore more in detail, in deep, the single aspects and sub-themes that are in the digital agenda of the G7 and implication for the larger picture. We have 15 minutes left, so I'll ask all of you to be in 3 to 4 minutes for a second round of question, where we would like to take advantage of your presence to explore, as I said, more in depth the main topics that will be examined, investigated for policy recommendation to the G7 by your respective task force. Darius Canapieco, in the context of the Italian presidency of the G7, we would like to know, how does the CDP plan to leverage its role in contributing to climate finance and sustainable development in developing countries and in emerging economies during this very crucial time interval? Over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, many thanks. We are the Italian Financial Institution for Development Cooperation, and we collaborate both with the Italian government, but also with the multilateral development banks and also bilateral banks to assist emerging economies in meeting their investment requirements for the green transition. Now, what are the ammunition that we have? We manage around 10 billion euros of public resources. which are mainly allocated to climate and environmental issues, but also the development of the local private sector, because many economies in developing countries are particularly characterized by a strong presence of the public sector. Now, for what concerns our own resources, almost half of them are dedicated to climate finance. So both public resources that we manage and our own resources are dedicated to climate. Then there is what I think is a game changer, which is the new Italian Climate Fund. It is already working. We have already approved the first projects. First of all, it's very innovative because for the first time, we have a large amount of resources, 4.2 billion in 5 years, that will be allocated to climate change mitigation and adaptation in emerging and developing economies. The second characteristic which makes it a unique tool is very flexible in terms of products. And moreover, it has a window which is particularly dedicated 200 million to technical assistance. Technical assistance is key because in these regions, in particular, when we're dealing with Africa, and 70% of this fund has to be allocated in Africa, frequently there are more financial resources than good projects. And therefore, it's very important to work with the local authorities to do capacity building and to help them preparing projects that can be financed from developing entities. We also, for instance, are invested in the green finance market at local level, because one of the answers to support these countries also to create a local financial ecosystem, so to enlarge the sources of funding for projects that can have a positive impact on climate. Clearly, it was mentioned before by the former speaker, by Chloe, yesterday there was this big event. I think it was a very successful event with many states from Africa represented, the Italian Africa Fund, and the President Meloni highlighted what are the priorities of the activity also under the G7 presidency of Italy. And we clearly put fight to climate change as one of the priority, but also the focus especially on Africa, because for demography, for contribution potentially to the GDP, world GDP in the future, it will be crucial. Now, what do we need? In my view, we need more coordination among DFIs, and we need more resources to finance all the projects, but we also need more grant to support technical assistance and the preparation of good projects and to design a common strategy. This is essentially what under the presidency of the G7 we as CDP will try to do. We will prompt proactive engagement with public development bank, development finance institution under the G7 to make sure that this effort to have more coordination, acting, all financiers as one single body, which is extremely coordinated, and to define pipeline of projects that can be financed and can produce a durable impact on the ground will be important. And of course, we look forward working with T7, relying on the expertise of the G7 think tanks, hopefully to be engaged with the coordinated action of the G7 public development banks and development finance institution.
Thank you very much, Dario Scannapiego, for your interventions. I'll stay in Task Force 2. I'll go back to Anna Katarina Ornic, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the panel, there's a wide range of topics that are under the works of this task force, and one of them is global health. We are 4 years after the COVID-19 crisis. What are lessons learned from this pretty recent global health crisis for global governance and action, and for the G7 specifically? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Fabrizio. I would like to sort of point to two main areas. One, of course, is the whole connection between health risks and environmental change, and there I would now actually include climate and biodiversity change. I think while you mentioned 4 years after the pandemic, but that's actually after the beginning of the pandemic. So we are still in many ways only now drawing some of the lessons from the pandemic. And one of the core lessons, I would say, is actually to establish a field of One Health, sometimes also called planetary health, but the interconnection between environmental changes, climate change, and human and animal health as an area where we lack a long-term data series, where we actually know that in most countries we don't have the keywords basically that bring the two fields together, where we have quite a strong fragmentation of policy making and steering happening. And we see and know from the pandemic how that has limited our abilities to invest into pandemic prevention as well as preparedness. And of course, this is it's a challenge of knowledge, basically. Yeah, we need to build the infrastructures of long-term data series that can create then the basis for respective One Health-oriented policy making. But it is also an immense challenge to position or to reorganize actually our institutional landscapes in a way that cooperation across organizational as well as across sectoral boundaries becomes more possible. This is one area. The other field I would like to sort of bring into the discussion is the whole. Well, we learned also out of the pandemic, of course, that transregional inequalities, impact and have an immense long-term impact also on the shaping of the multipolar order that we are all part of, that we are all in the process of shaping. And here we have on the one side seen in the past years steps taken towards addressing the structural limitations. For instance, we have seen quite substantial investments into production sites for vaccine production, for the production of medical requirements, products in East, West, and Southern Africa, in order to here build infrastructures for localized or for the strengthening of healthcare systems. This is structural policy making, but it's immensely time intensive and of course resource intensive, and will accompany us over the coming years as well. At the same time, I think we have also here seen quite some positive steps in a way, using also the G7 and the interaction with the G20 to push for an increased awareness for the need to on the one side build spaces for One Health and planetary health related policy making, and on the other side for not just development cooperation projects, but for structural policy making that invests into the healthcare systems, universal healthcare, but also specialized healthcare in different parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
Many thanks, many thanks, Anna Catarina Ornage, for your contribution to the debate, for your participation to the Inception conference of the T7 Italy. Let me jump back to the digital side of transition to Francesco Profumo. The governance of AI, it seems to be one of the central issue in the G7 Italy agenda, and also we've seen previous strong initiative from the Japanese presidency in 2023. The opportunities and potential risks of AI are increasingly debated, with contrasting views among policymakers, experts, and the civil society. How can we better proceed in facing the challenges of such a transformative technology? Over to you, Profumo.
Thank you, Fabrizio. All the technologies that have emerged are a game changer. We know that. Revolutionizing industry and transforming the way we live, work, and interact. Their ability to analyze vast amount of data, learn from patterns, and make intelligent decisions has the potential to solve some of humanity's most pressing problems, from healthcare and education to transportation and energy. They are driving innovation and paving the way for more efficient and sustainable development. Artificial intelligence, in particular, is rewriting the rules of trust and transparency because it has the power to deeply impact various sectors, such as finance, manufacturing, supply chain management, and governance. But these technologies are not mere tools. They can enable positive change for a better world. The true power of AI and blockchain lies in their potential to create a fairer and more equitable society. They can empower and marginalized communities, bridge the digital divide, and provide equal access to economic opportunities. By leveraging these technologies responsibly, we can really ensure that no one is left behind. However, let me highlight a specific point. We know something about AI and its potential, but my feeling is that we don't know everything about its applications. So we must also be careful of the ethical implication and potential risks. We must prioritize privacy, security, and ethical use of AI, ensuring that the technology is designed with human values and rights and at its core. We must continue to explore and refine the governance framework for AI, fostering collaboration and accountability to maximize its positive impact. But in front of us, we have huge opportunities. Goldman Sachs recently estimated that AI could eventually increase the annual global GDP by 7%. Another recent research by McKinsey has shown that AI can contribute to the achievement of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In this context, the strategy adopted by the G7, the AI Code of Conduct, and by the EU, the AI Act, emphasize the importance of a human-centric approach, transparency and accountability in the development and use of AI, and seek to establish a regulatory framework that enables innovation and growth while upholding fundamental ethical principles. This is the main commitment that, as the lead co-chair of the T7 Task Force, Science and Digitalization for a Better Future, I would like to achieve. The potential of AI must be deployed for the common good, accelerating a fair, inclusive, and sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco Profumo, for your participation to the Inception conference. A final question to Chloe Tivan, still on a sub-theme of your Task Force 4. What's the role of innovation for sustainable, human, and inclusive development, if we consider how the cooperation with Africa, the blocks, is considered as crucial for for the Italian presidency. Chloe,
Well,
sorry,
I
I'll
think
ask you to be brief.
yes, I'll be very brief. I think Francesco has already alluded to the fact that ultimately digital technologies and AI innovations will have a role to play in achieving all of the sustainable development goals, in in guaranteeing universal access to education, in improving healthcare outcomes, in achieving the twin transitions. But I do think that one element that to bring this back to the question of inclusivity, I do think that there's one element that I would urge the G7 to really consider again, is the question of who is actually able to produce these technologies and where are these technologies produced. And this connects with the question of infrastructure and with the question of working with Africa. They're both, I think both India last year and Brazil this year are also highlighting this question of the inclusivity of these technologies. And I think when it comes to also trying to regulate, it will be essential to work together with countries in the global south, not only on regulating these technologies, but also on investing in and producing these technologies. So some of the ideas that are emerging are around, the equivalent of the EU released its AI innovation package last week, which hopes to accompany the AI Act with measures that would actually support the data ecosystem in Europe and the sharing of data for AI companies to use to further their AI models, and as well as accessing supercomputers, etc. I think that what we need is ultimately to look at ways of doing this at a more global scale. But I'll leave it at that, given that we're already over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Chloe, Tivan. We run out of time, but on behalf of the T7 team, let me say thank you to express our gratitude to the panelists for their inspiring inputs and contribution to the debate that is a very promising kickoff of the T7 Italy process. Thanks to the audience for the interest and attention to our initiatives and activities. Please follow us on the T7 Italy site. You can also sign in on this newsletter and have automatically all the updates. I think that the T7 Italy 2024 Inception Conference ends here. Have a good day and a great 2024. Goodbye. Arrivederci.